After a personal tragedy shatters her spirit, schoolteacher Sarah Matthews wanders deep into the unforgiving mountains of Arizona territory, seeking solitude and escape from the life she no longer wants. When Apache hunter Kai finds her injured and half-starved 3 days into her desperate flight from civilization, he carries her back to his secluded canyon home. What begins as a simple rescue becomes something far more complicated as he refuses to let her return to the world she left behind. Trapped between fear and an unexpected sense of belonging in his hidden valley, Sarah must navigate the growing tension between her desire for freedom and her undeniable attraction to the man who saved her life. As days turn to weeks, she discovers that sometimes the greatest prison can also become the greatest sanctuary. But when her past comes searching for her, will she choose the safety of captivity or risk everything for love? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first thing Kai noticed was the glint of metal against pale skin, where the woman's hand lay motionless beside the mountain stream. A thin band of gold caught the afternoon sunlight, marking her as belonging to someone, somewhere in the world below. But here, in this remote corner of the Arizona territory where few white men dared to venture, she was utterly alone. He approached cautiously, his moccasined feet silent on the rocky ground. Years of hunting had taught him to read the signs of life and death, and this woman hovered dangerously close to the latter. Her breathing came in shallow, irregular gasps. Her lips, cracked and bleeding, spoke of days without water. The torn remnants of a once fine dress hung from her thin frame, and scratches from thorns and rocks decorated her exposed arms and legs, like a map of her desperate journey. Kai knelt beside her, his weathered hands hovering over her fevered brow. She was perhaps 25 years, with hair the color of autumn leaves that had once been carefully arranged but now lay matted against her skull. Even in her current state, he could see she had been beautiful, the kind of refined beauty that belonged to schoolrooms and parlors, not to the harsh wilderness that had nearly claimed her life. From the leather pouch at his belt, Kai withdrew items that had been blessed by his grandmother's grandmother, dried herbs that could draw poison from wounds, powdered roots that fought fever, and small stones worn smooth by generations of healing hands. The old ways were stronger than the white man's medicine, and this woman would need every advantage to survive what the mountains had done to her. He lifted her carefully, surprised by how little she weighed. Whatever had driven her into these peaks had stolen more than just her strength. It had carved away at her very substance until she felt as fragile as dried leaves in his arms. Her head lolled against his shoulder, and he heard her mumble words in her delirium. "Please, God, let me die. Please." The words struck him like a physical blow. In all his years of solitude, Kai had encountered few people who actively courted death. Life was sacred, something to be fought for and preserved. But this woman carried a pain so deep that she had sought out the most dangerous place she could find, hoping the mountains would grant her the peace she could not find in civilization. His hidden canyon lay 2 miles up a treacherous path that would challenge even an experienced climber. But Kai had been making this journey for 15 years, ever since he had chosen exile over integration with either his Apache people or the encroaching white settlements. He knew every handholds, every loose stone, every place where the trail narrowed to mere inches above deadly drops. As he climbed, the woman stirred occasionally in his arms. Once her eyes opened briefly, revealing irises the color of spring grass. She stared at him with no recognition, no fear, just a profound exhaustion that seemed to reach into her very soul. "Am I dead?" she whispered. "Not yet," he replied in accented English, "but you would have been by morning." She seemed to consider this, then closed her eyes again. "I was hoping," she said so quietly he almost missed it. The path to his canyon was hidden behind a curtain of hanging vines and carefully arranged stones that made it appear to be just another crack in the cliff face. Inside, the space opened into a natural amphitheater, perhaps 50 yards across, with a clear spring feeding a small pool and enough level ground for a comfortable dwelling. Kai had spent years making it livable, building furniture from deadfall, creating storage spaces in natural caves, and establishing small gardens in every spot where soil collected enough to support growth. He laid the woman on his own sleeping furs, then set about the careful work of keeping her alive. He bathed her wounds with water infused with healing herbs, dripped liquid into her mouth one careful drop at a time, and wrapped her in warm blankets woven from the wool of mountain sheep. Through the night, he maintained a careful vigil, monitoring her breathing, adjusting her position, and fighting the fever that threatened to claim her. In her delirium, she spoke of fire and loss, of children who would never learn their letters, of a man named Thomas who waited for her in a place she could never reach. The fragments painted a picture of tragedy so complete that Kai began to understand why she had sought death in the mountains. Some wounds cut too deep for ordinary healing. By dawn, her fever had broken, and her breathing had steadied into the rhythm of natural sleep rather than unconscious escape. Kai allowed himself a moment of satisfaction at having won this battle against death, then began preparing for the more complex challenge ahead. Convincing a woman who wanted to die that life still held possibilities worth embracing, Sarah's eyes opened to a world that couldn't possibly exist. Sunlight filtered through what appeared to be a natural skylight in stone, casting dancing patterns across smooth rock walls. The air smelled of sage and cedar, not the antiseptic sterility of a hospital room. She lay on something far more comfortable than the rocky ground she remembered collapsing upon, wrapped in furs that carried the scent of mountains and wood smoke. She tried to sit up and immediately regretted the decision. Her head spun violently, and every muscle in her body protested as if she had been trampled by horses. A gentle but firm hand pressed against her shoulder, guiding her back down to the furs. Slowly, said a deep voice with an accent she couldn't quite place, "You have been very sick." Sarah turned her head carefully and found herself looking at a man who seemed to have stepped from another century. His skin was the color of burnished copper, his hair black as midnight and hanging loose past his shoulders. He wore simple clothing made from leather and woven cloth, and his dark eyes held an intelligence that made her immediately aware of how vulnerable her position was. "Who are you?" she managed to whisper, her throat raw and dry. "I am Kai," he said, lifting a hand-carved wooden bowl to her lips. "Drink." The water was cool and sweet, with a taste that reminded her of melted snow. She drank greedily until he pulled the bowl away, leaving her wanting more. Only then did she notice the intricate carvings on the vessel, spiraling patterns that seemed to tell a story in a language she didn't understand. "Where am I?" Sarah asked, trying again to take in her surroundings. The space was larger than it had first appeared, extending back into shadows where she could make out stored supplies and what looked like a workshop area. Everything spoke of careful planning, of a life deliberately constructed in this hidden place. "Safe," Kai replied, setting the bowl aside and moving to tend a small fire that burned in a natural depression in the rock floor. "That is all you need to know for now." Sarah struggled to remember how she had come to be here. The last clear memory was of stumbling through dense forest, her throat parched, her vision blurring. Before that, images came in fragments: a train station, a hotel room, the suffocating weight of sympathy from strangers who couldn't understand her loss. She had fled all of it, seeking something she couldn't name in the wilderness. "I need to go," she said, attempting once more to rise. This time she managed to prop herself up on her elbows before the world tilted dangerously. "People will be looking for me." Kai glanced at her with something that might have been amusement. "No one followed you into the deep mountains. You made sure of that." The certainty in his voice troubled her. "How long have I been here?" 3 days, he said, stirring something in a pot that hung over the fire. The smell was foreign but not unpleasant, herbs and meat in a combination that made her stomach growl despite her anxiety. "You were near death when I found you by the stream." 3 days. Sarah tried to calculate how long she had been missing total, but the timeline blurred in her mind. She remembered buying supplies in the last town, remembered walking into the forest with nothing but her torn dress and a desperate need to escape. Beyond that, everything was confusion and pain. "I have to return," she said, though even as she spoke the words, she felt no conviction behind them. Return to what? The empty house in Philadelphia, the concerned faces of neighbors who whispered about her breakdown, the school board that had gently suggested she take as much time as she needed, their kindness making her feel even more broken. "The path down is dangerous," Kai said, not looking at her as he continued his cooking. "Many have died attempting it. Better to wait until you are stronger." Something in his tone made Sarah study his profile more carefully. He spoke of the dangerous path with casual authority, but there was something else in his words, something that suggested he might not be entirely eager to see her leave at all. "How dangerous?" she asked. Now he did look at her, and she saw depths in his dark eyes that spoke of knowledge hard-won through experience. "Dangerous enough that I will not allow you to attempt it until I am certain you can survive it." The word allow hung in the air between them like smoke from the fire. Sarah realized with growing unease that her gratitude for being rescued was about to become something far more complicated. By the 5th day, Sarah's strength had returned enough for her to explore the boundaries of her strange sanctuary. What she discovered both amazed and alarmed her. The canyon was indeed hidden, accessible only through the narrow passage Kai had carried her through, and that passage could be easily blocked with a few strategically placed stones. She realized with growing unease, completely at the mercy of her rescuer's goodwill. The remnants of her dress lay folded beside the sleeping furs, and Sarah fingered the torn fabric with something approaching grief. The blue cotton had been her finest dress, purchased for the wedding that would never happen. Now it was little more than rags, stained with blood and dirt, torn beyond any hope of repair. It seemed fitting somehow, a perfect metaphor for everything else in her life. Kai had provided her with simple clothing, a long tunic made from soft leather and leggings that allowed for easier movement than her constraining corset and petticoats ever had. The garments fit well enough, though she suspected they had been made for someone else. Another woman, perhaps, who had once shared this hidden place. "You're feeling stronger," Kai observed, returning from whatever task had occupied his morning. He carried a brace of rabbits and moved with the fluid grace of someone completely at home in the wilderness. "Strong enough to leave," Sarah said, testing the words to see how he would respond. Kai began the methodical process of cleaning his catch, his hands sure and efficient with the knife. "Leave for where?" he asked without looking up. "You told me in your fever that you had nowhere to go, no one waiting for your return." Sarah's cheeks burned. She had no memory of revealing such intimate details, but the fever dreams had been vivid and painful. "I may have been confused. The fever." "The fever stripped away your careful words and left only truth," Kai interrupted gently. "You spoke of fire and death, of a man named Thomas, who died because you could not save him. You spoke of children whose names you taught, who perished because their teacher failed them." The words hit Sarah like physical blows, and she sank onto a nearby stone. The memories she had been fighting crashed over her with renewed force. The schoolhouse fire, the screams of trapped children, Thomas rushing into the flames to help evacuate them, the beam that had fallen, crushing her fiancé and 3 of her students before she could warn them, the baby she had lost 3 days later from the trauma and smoke. "I killed them," she whispered, the confession tearing from her throat like broken glass. "I should have gotten them out faster. I should have checked the stove more carefully that morning. I should have." "You should have been a fortune teller who could see the future," Kai said, his voice carrying unexpected gentleness. "Or perhaps you should have had the power to hold up falling timbers with your bare hands." Sarah looked up at him through her tears, startled by the mild sarcasm in his tone. "You blame yourself for things no mortal person could control," he continued, setting aside his work to crouch before her. "This is the luxury of survivors, to torture themselves with impossible scenarios where they could have changed what cannot be changed. You don't understand." "I understand perfectly," Kai said, his dark eyes holding memories as painful as her own. "I have stood in the ashes of my own failures and demanded that the dead forgive me for living when they could not." Something in his voice made Sarah believe him. This man had known loss as devastating as her own, had walked through his own version of hell, and somehow found the strength to continue breathing. "The people in town will search for me," she said, though the protest sounded weak, even to her own ears. Kai returned to his rabbits, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "Perhaps, but you covered your trail well when you fled into the mountains. And even if someone were to track you this far, they would not find this place unless I chose to let them." The certainty in his voice sent a chill down Sarah's spine. "You can't keep me here against my will." "I cannot," Kai asked, finally looking at her directly. "Who will stop me? The law that exists 2 days' ride away? The society that drove you to seek death in the wilderness?" Sarah stood slowly, her legs still unsteady but her resolve strengthening. "I will stop you." Kai smiled, and for the first time, Sarah saw something dangerous in the expression. "You are welcome to try," he said softly, "but remember that you came to these mountains seeking death. I offer you something different, the chance to discover what life might hold if you stopped running from it." Sarah woke before dawn with a plan crystallizing in her mind. For 3 days, she had observed Kai's routines, noting when he left the canyon and for how long. This morning, he had mentioned checking snares in the higher elevations, a task that typically kept him away for several hours. It would be her best chance to test whether his warnings about the dangerous path were truth or manipulation. She waited until his footsteps faded completely before moving to the canyon's entrance. The passage was narrower than she remembered, barely wide enough for one person, and it twisted in ways that quickly hid the canyon from view. But it was passable, and Sarah felt a surge of hope as she began her descent. The first hour went well. The path, while steep and rocky, was manageable for someone with reasonable caution. Sarah began to think that Kai had exaggerated the dangers to keep her compliant. Perhaps the Apache hunter wasn't quite as formidable as he wanted her to believe. The second hour taught her differently. The path narrowed to mere inches, with sheer drops on one side and crumbling rock on the other. Loose stones skittered away under her feet, echoing ominously in the canyon depths below. Her borrowed moccasins, while comfortable, provided little grip on the smooth stone surfaces worn slick by wind and weather. By the third hour, Sarah was clinging to handholds barely large enough for her fingertips, her muscles screaming with exhaustion. The simple leather clothing that had seemed so practical in the canyon now felt inadequate protection against the mountain's harsh embrace. Thorns tore at her arms, and rocks bit through the soft soles of her footwear. She had just navigated a particularly treacherous section when she heard the sound that chilled her blood, the distinctive rattle of a snake somewhere very close. Sarah froze, scanning the narrow ledge where she crouched, but the sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "They like the warm rocks in the afternoon sun," came Kai's voice from somewhere above her. "Diamondbacks are common in these parts. Their bite is usually fatal, especially when you're too far from help for the poison to be drawn out." Sarah looked up to see him standing on a ledge perhaps 20 feet above, as comfortable on the precarious perch as she might be standing in a parlor. His hunting knife gleamed in his hand, the curved blade catching the sunlight in ways that made it seem to pulse with its own life. "How did you?" she began, then stopped. Of course he had known of her escape attempt. He probably had ways of monitoring the canyon that she couldn't even imagine. "I have been tracking prey through these mountains for 15 years, Kai said, beginning his descent toward her with the easy confidence of someone who belonged in this vertical world. Did you think I would not notice when the most important thing in my territory decided to wander off?" The words "most important thing" sent conflicting emotions through Sarah's chest. There was possessiveness in them, yes, but also something that sounded almost like tenderness. "I'm not your property," she said, though her position clinging to the cliff face made the protest feel somewhat hollow. "Perhaps not," Kai agreed, reaching the ledge beside her with fluid grace, "but you are my responsibility. I pulled you back from death, which means your life is connected to mine now. The old ways teach that such bonds are not easily broken." He extended his hand to her, and Sarah realized she had little choice but to accept his help. Her own strength was nearly exhausted, and the path ahead looked even more treacherous than what she had already traversed. "This is kidnapping," she said as his strong fingers closed around her wrist. "This is survival," Kai corrected. "The difference is that kidnapping assumes you had somewhere safe to return to. Tell me, Sarah Matthews, what waits for you in the world below? What life calls you back so urgently that you would risk dying on these cliffs?" Sarah found she had no answer for him. The truth was that she had fled into the mountains precisely because there was nothing calling her back. No home that felt like home, no work that gave her purpose, no future that held anything but reminders of all she had lost. The climb back to the canyon took twice as long as her descent, with Kai patiently guiding her through the most difficult passages. His hands were sure and steady when hers faltered, his voice calm and encouraging when panic threatened to overwhelm her. By the time they reached the hidden entrance, Sarah was forced to acknowledge that without his help, she would certainly have died on the mountain face. "The path is real," she said once they were safely inside the canyon. "The path is real," Kai confirmed, "as is my promise that you will not travel it alone until you are ready to survive it." That evening, as Sarah sat beside the fire, nursing her scraped hands and wounded pride, she noticed Kai retrieving something from a leather pouch she hadn't seen before. He handled the object with unusual care, and when he held it up to the firelight, Sarah saw it was a pressed flower, a simple daisy, its white petals preserved between thin sheets of what looked like birch bark. "Where did that come from?" she asked, surprised by the delicate treasure in such a rugged environment. Kai's expression grew thoughtful as he studied the flower. "From your belongings. It fell from a book when I was checking your things for anything that might help save your life." Sarah's breath caught. She remembered now. The flower had been pressed in her copy of McGuffey's Reader, placed there by one of her students as a gift. Little Mary Caldwell had presented it to her with such solemnity, explaining that her mother said teachers needed beautiful things to remind them why learning mattered. "Mary gave that to me," Sarah whispered, tears threatening to spill over. "She was 7 years old. She died in the fire." Kai nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he had already suspected. "You carried it with you into the mountains. Even in your desperation to die, you could not leave behind this small piece of love." Sarah stared at the preserved flower, remembering Mary's gap-toothed smile and her careful handwriting as she practiced her letters. The child had struggled with reading, but possessed an artist's eye for beauty, often decorating her slates with tiny drawings of flowers and birds between arithmetic problems. "Tell me about her," Kai said, settling beside Sarah with the flower still cradled in his palm. "She was special," Sarah began, surprised by how much she wanted to share these memories. Her family was poor, and she came to school in dresses that were too big and shoes with holes, but she never missed a day, and she always found something to smile about. As she spoke, other memories surfaced. The way Mary would save bits of her lunch to feed the birds outside the schoolhouse window, how she would help younger children with their lessons during recess, the proud expression on her face when she finally read an entire paragraph without stumbling over the words. She wanted to be a teacher herself someday, Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger as she remembered. She said she wanted to help children learn to read so they could discover all the wonderful stories in books. What would she think of her teacher giving up on all the children who still need to discover those stories? Kai asked gently. The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. "That's not fair. I can't teach anymore. Every time I think about standing in front of a classroom, I see flames, I hear screaming. I remember how I failed them. You remember how you survived," Kai corrected. "And survival carries responsibility." Sarah wanted to argue, but something in his tone suggested he spoke from personal experience with guilt and survival. "What do you know about it? You live alone in the mountains, avoiding all responsibility for anyone but yourself." For a long moment Kai was silent, his dark eyes reflecting the dancing flames. Then he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of old pain. "I was 17 when the soldiers came to our village. I was supposed to be standing watch that night, but I had grown careless, more interested in impressing a girl than in protecting my people. I saw the dust cloud of their approach, but I thought it was a trading party coming early for the spring gathering." Sarah could hear the self-recrimination in his voice, the echo of her own guilt. "By the time I realized my mistake, it was too late. They killed everyone. My parents, my grandparents, my younger sister. 43 people died because I was a foolish boy who thought the world was safer than it was." "That wasn't your fault," Sarah said automatically, then stopped as she heard her own words. "The soldiers made the choice to attack. You couldn't have stopped them alone." "Perhaps not," Kai agreed, "but I could have given my people warning to fight or flee. Instead, I survived by hiding while my family died." Sarah studied his profile in the firelight, seeing the lines that grief and guilt had carved into his features. "Is that why you live alone? Because you think you don't deserve community?" "I live alone because I learned that caring for people means being prepared to lose them," Kai said. "But lately, I have begun to think that avoiding loss also means avoiding the possibility of saving someone." He held the pressed flower out to her, and Sarah took it with trembling fingers. The delicate petals seemed to pulse with life despite their preservation, carrying with them all of Mary's unfulfilled dreams and stubborn hope. "She would want you to keep teaching," Kai said quietly, "not because you owe it to the dead, but because you owe it to the living." The next morning, Sarah woke to find Kai studying something with intense concentration. As she approached, she saw he held an old photograph, its edges worn soft from handling. The image was faded but clear enough to show a group of Apache people standing before traditional dwellings, their faces solemn in the formal manner of early photography. "Your family?" Sarah asked softly. Kai nodded, pointing to a young woman holding a small child. "My mother, Ayana, and my sister Cholena. She was only 8 when they died." His finger moved to an older man with kind eyes. "My grandfather, who taught me to hunt and track, and my grandmother, who knew the healing plants." Sarah studied the faces in the photograph, trying to imagine them alive and laughing, going about the daily business of living. It was easier to understand Kai's isolation when she could see what he had lost, not just individual people, but an entire way of life, a community that had shaped him from birth. "How did you get this picture?" she asked, noting the quality suggested it had been taken by a professional photographer. "A missionary came through our village the summer before the attack," Kai explained. "He wanted to document the noble savage before we all disappeared. My grandfather thought it was foolish, but my mother insisted. She said someday her grandchildren might want to see how their people lived." The irony in his voice was sharp as a blade. There would be no grandchildren, no continuation of the family line that stretched back generations through the harsh beauty of these mountains. "You never married, never tried to rebuild what was lost?" Sarah asked. Kai was quiet for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of 15 years of solitude. "I tried once. There was a woman in the settlement 2 days south of here, a widow with children who needed a father. I thought perhaps I could make a new kind of family, one that didn't carry the ghosts of my failure. What happened? I woke up one night in a cold sweat because I had heard sounds that reminded me of that night. Children laughing turned into children screaming in my dreams. I realized I was terrified every moment that I would fail them as I had failed my blood family. So I left before I could cause them harm." Sarah felt a pang of recognition in his words. "You punished yourself by choosing loneliness." "I chose safety," Kai corrected, "for them and for me. But you saved me," Sarah pointed out. "You brought a stranger into your sanctuary, risked your solitude for someone you didn't know." Kai looked at her then, his dark eyes holding an expression she couldn't quite read. "You were dying. The choice was simple: save you or watch you perish. I could not watch another person die when I had the power to prevent it. And now," Sarah asked, "now that I'm not dying, what happens to your safe solitude?" The question hung between them like smoke from the fire. Sarah realized she was holding her breath, waiting for his answer. Somewhere in the past week, her desperation to escape had transformed into something more complex. She still wanted freedom, but she also found herself drawn to this man who carried his pain with such dignity, who had chosen to save her despite the cost to his carefully constructed defenses. "Now I find myself remembering why my grandmother used to say that the heart makes its own choices, regardless of what the mind thinks is wise," Kai said finally. "What did she mean?" Kai traced the faces in the photograph with gentle fingers. "She meant that love is not logical. It does not weigh risks and benefits before deciding where to settle. It simply arrives, like a storm or a season, and changes everything it touches." Sarah felt her cheeks warm at the word love, though she wasn't sure if he was speaking generally or specifically. "Do you think she was right?" "I think she was the wisest woman I ever knew," Kai said, carefully tucking the photograph back into its protective wrapping. "And I think she would have liked you very much." The compliment caught Sarah off guard. She had become so accustomed to thinking of herself as broken, as someone who brought disaster to those around her, that the idea of being liked by someone's wise grandmother seemed impossible. "You don't know me well enough to say that," she protested. "I know you carried a flower given to you by a child into what you thought would be your death," Kai said. "I know you blame yourself for things beyond your control. I know you have enough courage to risk everything for what you believe is right, even when what you believe is wrong, and those things would make your grandmother like me." Kai smiled, and for the first time since she had known him, the expression reached his eyes. "Those things would make her say you have a heart worthy of healing, if you would let it happen." The mountain storm struck without warning, transforming the peaceful canyon into a cauldron of wind and rain. Sarah had been helping Kai organize supplies when the first drops fell, but within minutes the gentle patter became a torrential downpour that sent them scrambling for shelter. Kai's dwelling, carved into the natural cave system, provided protection from the wind, but not from the cold that seemed to seep through the stone walls. As night fell and the temperature dropped, Sarah found herself shivering despite the layers of clothing and furs she had wrapped around herself. "The fire is not enough tonight," Kai said, observing her chattering teeth with growing concern. "This storm will bring the high mountain cold down into the canyon." Sarah tried to protest that she was fine, but her body betrayed her with violent shudders that made speech difficult. She had never experienced cold like this, a bone-deep chill that seemed to steal warmth faster than her body could produce it. Without a word, Kai began spreading his largest blanket near the fire, the one woven from mountain sheep wool that he usually kept folded at the foot of his sleeping area. The thick textile was large enough to cover two people comfortably, and Sarah realized with a mixture of embarrassment and anticipation what he was suggesting. "I can't," she began, though her protest was undermined by another violent shiver. "You will freeze," Kai said simply. "I have lived through many such storms. Shared warmth is not a luxury tonight, it is survival." As if to emphasize his point, a gust of wind howled through the canyon, sending icy air swirling through the cave entrance. Sarah pulled her furs tighter, but the cold seemed to find every gap in her defenses. "This is not proper," she said, though even as she spoke the words, she recognized how foolish they sounded. Propriety was a luxury for people who weren't at risk of freezing to death in a mountain storm. "There is nothing improper about not dying," Kai replied, settling onto one edge of the blanket and patting the space beside him. "Come." Sarah hesitated for another moment, then pragmatism overcame her reservations. She moved to the blanket, lying down with her back to Kai, trying to maintain as much distance as possible while still sharing the warmth. But the cold was relentless, and gradually she found herself moving closer to the heat that radiated from his body. Kai's arm came around her carefully, respectfully, creating a cocoon of warmth that immediately began to chase away the bone-deep chill. Sarah felt herself relaxing for the first time since the storm began, her body finally able to stop fighting the cold and simply rest. "Better?" Kai asked, his voice soft in the darkness. "Much," Sarah admitted, surprised by how safe she felt in his embrace. She had expected to feel trapped or threatened, but instead she felt protected, cherished even. They lay in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the storm rage outside their shelter. The shared blanket created an intimate space that felt separate from the rest of the world, a place where the usual rules and expectations seemed suspended. "Thank you," Sarah said eventually, "for saving my life, again." "It is becoming a habit," Kai replied, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "A troublesome one, I'm sure." "Not troublesome," he said after a pause. "Unexpected." Sarah turned slightly in his arms so she could see his face in the firelight. "What do you mean?" "I chose solitude because I thought it was safer than caring for someone who could be lost," Kai said. "But these past weeks with you have reminded me that safety is not the same as living. I'm hardly an advertisement for the joys of living," Sarah said with bitter humor. "I came here to die, remember? And yet you are here, warm and alive, arguing with me about propriety during a mountain storm," Kai pointed out. "Perhaps you are not as determined to die as you believed." Sarah considered this, realizing that somewhere in the past weeks, her desperate desire for death had faded into something else. She still carried her grief and guilt, but they no longer felt like insurmountable weights, threatening to crush her. "Maybe I'm just too stubborn to die," she said. "Stubbornness is a useful trait for survival," Kai agreed, his arm tightening slightly around her, "especially when combined with courage and compassion." "You think I'm courageous. I think you are many things you do not see in yourself," Kai said, "including worthy of being saved." The words settled into Sarah's heart, like warmth spreading through frozen limbs. For the first time since the fire, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that her life might have value beyond her guilt and grief. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside their shared blanket, Sarah felt something she had thought lost forever, the quiet peace of being exactly where she belonged. 3 weeks into her stay in the hidden canyon, Sarah's world shattered again, but this time from an entirely different direction. She was gathering herbs with Kai when he suddenly froze, his head tilted in the listening position she had learned to recognize. Without a word, he grabbed her hand and pulled her behind a large boulder, pressing a finger to his lips for silence. In the distance, she could hear what had caught his attention, voices echoing off the canyon walls, the sound of horses picking their way carefully down rocky slopes, and the distinctive jingle of spurs and tack that marked professional riders. "Stay hidden," Kai whispered, his face grim with concern. "Do not move until I return." He melted into the landscape with the fluid grace that never failed to amaze her, becoming one with the rocks and shadows, until she could no longer track his movement, even when she knew roughly where he had gone. Sarah crouched behind the boulder, her heart pounding as the voices grew closer. She caught fragments of conversation carried on the mountain wind. "Tracks lead this direction. Reward money. Says she's been missing near 3 weeks. Probably dead by now, but the family wants certainty." The words "reward money" sent a chill through Sarah's bones. Someone was actively searching for her, offering payment for her return. The reality of her old life, which had seemed so distant and irrelevant in recent weeks, crashed back with startling force. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the voices faded as the search party moved on to other areas. Kai reappeared beside her so quietly that she jumped, stifling a cry of surprise. "Bounty hunters," he said grimly, settling beside her in the shelter of the rock. "3 men, well armed, with a description of you and instructions to search these mountains." From his shirt, he pulled out a crumpled piece of paper that made Sarah's blood run cold. It was a wanted poster, featuring a reasonably accurate sketch of her face above text that read, "Missing Sarah Matthews, schoolteacher. $500 reward for safe return. Last seen near Prescott. Family fears abduction." Sarah stared at her own face rendered in stark black ink, the artist having captured something in her expression that she recognized as the haunted look she had carried since the fire. But the words "family fears abduction" struck her like a physical blow. $500, she whispered. "That's more money than most people see in a year. Enough to make poor men risk their lives in dangerous mountains," Kai agreed darkly. "They will not give up easily." Sarah studied the poster, noting details that made her stomach clench with anxiety. "This was issued by my brother James. He's a sheriff in Colorado Territory. If he's involved, there will be more search parties." Kai's expression grew even more troubled. "A lawman with resources and authority. That complicates things considerably." "I have to go back," Sarah said, though the words felt like swallowing broken glass. "If people are risking their lives to search for me, if my family is spending money they can't afford, do you want to go back?" Kai interrupted, his dark eyes studying her face intently. The question hung between them like a bridge she wasn't sure she was ready to cross. A month ago, the answer would have been an immediate yes, anything to escape the pain that drove her into the mountains. But now, after weeks of peace in this hidden sanctuary, after discovering that she could wake up without immediately wishing she hadn't, the prospect of returning to her old life filled her with something approaching dread. "I don't know," she admitted. "Everything that drove me away is still waiting there. The empty house, the sympathetic looks, the constant reminders of what I lost. But people are looking for me, Kai. They're worried. People you have not seen or heard from since you left." Kai pointed out, "Where were these concerned searchers when you were walking into the wilderness hoping to die?" The observation stung because it was true. In her grief-stricken state, she had isolated herself from anyone who might have prevented her desperate flight. The search party was less about genuine concern and more about social obligation and family duty. "My brother loves me," she said, though even as she spoke the words, she remembered James's last letter, full of practical advice about moving on and finding a new husband, as if her grief was simply a problem to be solved. "Perhaps," Kai said gently, "but does he understand you?" Sarah looked at the wanted poster again, seeing herself through the eyes of people who knew her before the fire, who remembered the competent schoolteacher she had been rather than the broken woman she had become. The gap between those two versions of herself felt unbridgeable. "They think I was kidnapped," she said finally. "They can't imagine that I would choose this. Can you?" Kai asked, his voice carrying a weight that made her look up at him sharply. "Can you imagine choosing this life, Sarah? Choosing me?" That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She sat by the dying fire, turning her teaching certificate over in her hands. The official document, still crisp despite its journey into the mountains, bore the seal of the Pennsylvania State Board of Education and proclaimed her qualified to educate children in reading, writing, and arithmetic. Once, it had represented her proudest achievement. Now it felt like evidence of a life that belonged to someone else. The certificate had survived the schoolhouse fire because she kept it at home, framed on her bedroom wall. She had packed it when fleeing Philadelphia, though she couldn't say why. Perhaps some part of her had hoped that carrying proof of who she used to be would somehow help her find her way back to that person. "You cannot sleep," Kai observed, emerging from the shadows where he had been keeping watch for any sign of the bounty hunter's return. "Too much to think about," Sarah replied, holding up the document. "I found this in my things. It seems ridiculous now, carrying around a piece of paper that says I'm qualified to teach children when I failed so completely at protecting them." Kai settled beside her, studying the ornate certificate with interest. "What does it take to earn such a thing?" 2 years of normal school, examinations in every subject, demonstration lessons observed by experienced teachers, Sarah recited. "I thought I was so prepared, so ready to shape young minds and change lives." "And did you? Before the fire, did you change lives?" Sarah considered the question, memories surfacing of students who had struggled with letters until they suddenly clicked into reading, of children who discovered they had talent for numbers or a love of poetry. "Some of them, yes. I had students who went on to attend high school, which their parents never thought possible. Others who learned to love books enough to keep reading after they left my classroom." "Then you were successful," Kai said simply. "The fire does not erase the good you accomplished." "The fire erases everything," Sarah said bitterly. 3 children died, Kai. 3 bright, beautiful souls who trusted me to keep them safe. How do I weigh that against a few students who learned to read better?" "You do not weigh them," Kai said. "You carry them both, the grief and the joy, the failure and the success. That is what it means to have lived a full life." Sarah stared at the certificate, seeing not just her own name, but the names of professors who had believed in her potential, the signature of the administrator who had handed it to her with congratulations and hopes for her future. So many people had invested in her becoming a teacher, and she had simply walked away from all of it. "The bounty hunters will keep coming," she said, changing the subject, because thinking about her teaching career hurt too much. "Even if these 3 give up, others will try for that reward money." "Probably," Kai agreed. "Your brother appears to be a persistent man." "He is," Sarah confirmed. "James doesn't give up on things he considers his responsibility, and I've been his responsibility since our parents died." "What would happen if you returned?" Kai asked. "Would you go back to teaching?" Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "How could I? Every parent in town would know about the fire, about how I failed to protect my students. Who would trust their children to a teacher who let 3 of them die?" "Perhaps someone who understood that tragedy is not the same as failure," Kai suggested. "Perhaps someone who valued experience over innocence." "You have more faith in people's forgiveness than I do," Sarah said, folding the certificate carefully. "Besides, I'm not sure I could walk into another classroom without seeing flames every time a child moved too close to the stove." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire burn down to glowing coals. Sarah found herself thinking not about the fire, but about the morning lessons she used to love, the quiet concentration as children worked through problems, the moment of delight when understanding dawned, the satisfaction of helping young minds discover their own capabilities. "What if you could teach again, but differently?" Kai asked eventually. "What if there were children who needed education but couldn't attend a traditional school?" Sarah looked at him curiously. "What do you mean?" "The Apache children living near the settlements, caught between 2 worlds, the mixed-blood children who belong fully to neither culture, the children of families too poor or too remote for regular schooling." Kai's voice carried a thoughtfulness that suggested he had been considering this for some time. "They need teachers too." The idea caught Sarah off guard. She had never considered teaching outside the formal structure of public education, but the concept sparked something in her that had been dormant since the fire, a sense of purpose beyond her own grief. "You're talking about a very different kind of teaching," she said slowly. "Perhaps a kind that would suit a very different kind of teacher," Kai replied, his eyes meeting hers across the dying fire. "Someone who understands loss, who knows that survival requires different skills than success." The morning after their conversation about teaching, Sarah woke to find Kai crafting something at his workbench. His hands moved with practiced precision as he shaped a piece of wood into what appeared to be a gardening tool, though unlike any she had seen before. The handle was carved with intricate patterns that seemed to tell a story, while the metal blade had been carefully fitted and secured with strips of leather. "What are you making?" she asked, fascinated by the artistry involved in creating such a practical object. "A dibble stick," Kai replied, holding up the finished tool. "For planting seeds in precise patterns. My grandmother taught me to make them when I was young." Sarah examined the tool more closely, noting how the carved patterns seemed to flow like water around the smooth handle. "It's beautiful, too beautiful to use for digging in dirt." "Beauty and function are not enemies," Kai said, offering her the tool to hold. "My people believe that the more care you put into making something, the more care it will bring to the work it performs." The dibble stick felt perfectly balanced in Sarah's hands, the carved surface providing just enough texture for a secure grip. She could imagine using it to plant seeds in neat rows, creating gardens that would feed and sustain life for seasons to come. "I thought you might want to try creating something new," Kai continued, gesturing toward a section of the canyon where morning sunlight fell in abundance. "We could clear that area and plant it for spring. Nothing elaborate, just a small garden where things could grow." Sarah looked at the suggested plot, seeing possibilities she hadn't noticed before. The soil appeared rich, protected from the worst winds but open to sun and rain. It would be perfect for vegetables, perhaps some herbs, maybe even flowers that would attract butterflies and birds to the canyon. "I've never planted a garden," she admitted. "In Philadelphia, I lived in a boarding house with no yard. Before that, my family's farm was my father's domain." "Then this will be something entirely new," Kai said. "A fresh start with no memories attached, good or bad." The idea appealed to Sarah more than she had expected. For weeks, she had been living in the space between her old life and some undefined future, uncertain where she belonged or what purpose might give her days meaning. The prospect of creating something with her own hands, of nurturing life from seed to harvest, felt like a bridge between who she had been and who she might become. Over the following days, they worked together to prepare the garden plot. Kai showed her how to read the soil, how to identify the subtle signs that indicated fertility and drainage. Sarah learned to use the dibble stick with increasing confidence, finding satisfaction in the rhythmic work of creating furrows and planting holes. As they worked, they talked about many things: Kai's childhood memories of helping his grandmother tend her plants, Sarah's experiences with her most challenging students, the way both gardening and teaching required patience and faith in unseen growth. The conversations flowed as naturally as water finding its course, and Sarah realized she was sharing thoughts and feelings she had never expressed to anyone. "In Philadelphia, I felt like I was always performing," she said one afternoon as they planted beans that Kai had saved from previous seasons. "Being the proper teacher, the suitable fiancé, the dutiful daughter, there was never space to just be myself." "And who is yourself?" Kai asked, sitting back on his heels to study her face. Sarah considered the question, realizing she wasn't entirely sure. "I used to think I knew, but the fire changed everything. Stripped away all the roles I thought defined me. Now I feel like I'm discovering who I am, underneath all those expectations." "And what are you discovering?" "That I'm stronger than I thought," Sarah said slowly, "and more adaptable. I never imagined I could survive in a place like this, learn skills I never needed before, find peace in such isolation." "You are discovering that you are more than your circumstances," Kai observed. "That is wisdom worth the price of solitude." As Sarah planted the last row of seeds, she found herself thinking about growth, not just of the vegetables they had sown, but of the changes occurring within herself. The garden would require tending, patience, and faith that tiny seeds would become sustaining plants. Her own transformation seemed to follow similar principles. "Thank you," she said as they finished their work for the day. "For the gardening lessons? For showing me that it's possible to plant new things, even when you're not sure what will grow," Sarah replied, looking at the freshly worked earth that held such promise for the future. The tension that had been building for weeks finally reached its breaking point on a clear morning when Sarah discovered Kai examining something at the canyon entrance. As she approached, she saw he held his grandfather's war club, a fearsome weapon carved from oak and inlaid with stones, its surface polished smooth by generations of hands. She had never seen him handle it before, and its presence filled her with unease. "Are we expecting trouble?" she asked, noting the grim set of his jaw. "Perhaps," Kai replied, testing the weapon's balance with practiced movements. "The bounty hunters returned during the night. They are more persistent than I hoped." Sarah felt her stomach drop. For the past week, they had enjoyed a peaceful routine of garden work and quiet conversations, and she had allowed herself to hope that the search for her had been abandoned. "How many?" "The same 3, but they have brought tracking dogs this time," Kai said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood the implications. "Dogs change everything. They will follow scent trails that human trackers might miss." The war club seemed to pulse with menace in Kai's hands, its stones catching the morning light like watching eyes. Sarah realized she was seeing a side of him that he had kept carefully hidden, not just the gentle healer who had saved her life, but the warrior whose ancestors had fought to protect their people against impossible odds. "You're planning to fight them," she said, "and it wasn't a question." "I am planning to protect what matters to me," Kai corrected, his dark eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "These men see you as a commodity to be collected for profit. They do not care about your well-being, only about the reward money." "You can't kill them, Kai," Sarah said, though even as she spoke the words, she wondered what alternatives existed. "If bounty hunters disappear in these mountains, my brother will send soldiers. You'll have the entire territorial army hunting for you." "Then what do you suggest?" Kai asked, and Sarah heard the challenge in his voice. "That I simply hand you over to men who will drag you back to a life that drove you to seek death." The question struck Sarah like a physical blow, because it forced her to confront the choice she had been avoiding for weeks. She could no longer pretend that her time in the canyon was temporary, that she was simply recovering before returning to her old life. The bounty hunters represented a fork in the path: return to Philadelphia and the suffocating weight of other people's expectations, or stay with Kai and accept whatever consequences that choice might bring. "I want my freedom," she said finally, the words torn from somewhere deep in her chest. Real freedom, not the illusion of choice between 2 forms of captivity. Kai set down the war club, his expression shifting from warrior-like determination to something more vulnerable. "What does freedom mean to you, Sarah?" "It means choosing my own path without having it chosen for me," she said, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. "It means not being anyone's responsibility or burden or rescue project. It means standing on my own feet and making my own decisions about what my life should look like. Even if that decision disappoints people who claim to love you." "Especially then," Sarah said, realizing as she spoke that she meant it completely. "Love that requires me to be someone I'm not isn't really love at all." Kai studied her face for a long moment, and Sarah saw something shift in his expression, a recognition that she was no longer the broken woman he had carried half-dead from the mountain stream. "And if I asked you to stay, if I admitted that I have come to care for you more than is wise, and that the thought of losing you feels like facing that cavalry attack all over again?" Sarah's heart began racing, but not from fear. The vulnerability in Kai's voice, the admission that she had become precious to him, stirred emotions she had thought died with Thomas in the schoolhouse fire. "Then I would say that asking and demanding are 2 different things," she replied softly. "And I would tell you that I have feelings for you that terrify me, because caring about someone means risking the kind of loss I swore I would never face again. But you would stay." Kai pressed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I would choose," Sarah said firmly. "Not because you saved my life, not because I'm grateful or dependent or afraid to leave. I would choose because this canyon feels more like home than anywhere I've ever lived, and you feel more like my match than any man I've ever known." Kai reached for her then, his hands framing her face with gentle reverence. "Then we face the bounty hunters together," he said, "as equals, as partners, as people who choose each other freely." Sarah nodded, feeling something fundamental shift inside her chest. For the first time since the fire, she felt truly alive. The storm struck with the fury of an angry god, transforming the peaceful canyon into a battleground between wind and stone. Sarah and Kai barely had time to secure their supplies before the first violent gusts sent loose objects flying through the air like weapons. What had started as dark clouds on the horizon became a tempest that seemed determined to tear their world apart. Within an hour, their carefully maintained living space was in chaos. The fire had been extinguished by driving rain that found every crack and crevice in the rock walls. Their food stores were scattered, and water poured in torrents down the canyon walls, turning the normally dry floor into a rushing stream that threatened to wash away everything they had built together. "The supply cave," Kai shouted over the howling wind, pointing toward a deeper recess in the rock face. "We need to move everything we can save." Working together with desperate efficiency, they gathered what remained of their possessions and carried them to higher ground. But as the storm intensified, it became clear that even the supply cave might not provide adequate shelter. Water began seeping through cracks they had never noticed, and the wind created a terrifying symphony of sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the canyon. "There," Kai said, spotting a narrow cleft in the rock wall that they had never explored. "It's our only chance." The opening was barely wide enough for one person, but it led to a small chamber that appeared to be completely sealed from the storm's fury. Kai quickly gathered materials to create a makeshift shelter within the cramped space, his heaviest blanket stretched between protruding rocks, their remaining dry clothing piled to create insulation, and their few essential supplies arranged within easy reach. Sarah squeezed into the improvised shelter, grateful for any protection from the storm's violence. But as Kai joined her in the confined space, she realized they would be pressed together far more intimately than the shared blanket experience of weeks earlier. The shelter was barely large enough for two people lying down, with no room for the careful distance they had maintained despite their growing feelings. "This is cozy," Sarah said, attempting humor despite the gravity of their situation. "This is survival," Kai replied, but she heard warmth in his voice as he arranged the blanket over both of them. "The storm will pass, but we need to conserve body heat until it does." Outside their small refuge, the tempest raged with increasing fury. Sarah had never experienced weather so violent, so utterly indifferent to human comfort or safety. The sound was overwhelming. Wind that screamed like lost souls, rain that hammered against stone like bullets, and an underlying rumble that suggested the very mountains were groaning under the assault. Pressed against Kai's warmth in their tiny shelter, Sarah found herself acutely aware of every point where their bodies touched. His arm around her shoulders, her head resting against his chest, the steady rhythm of his breathing that gradually began to calm her storm-induced panic. Despite the chaos outside, she felt safer than she had since childhood. "Tell me about your grandmother," she said, needing distraction from both the storm and her growing awareness of Kai's physical presence. Kai's voice rumbled through his chest as he spoke, creating a vibration she could feel as well as hear. She was tiny but fierce, like a hawk in human form. She could track wounded animals through terrain that would challenge most hunters, and she knew every plant that grew in these mountains. As he spoke, Sarah found herself relaxing despite their precarious situation. Kai's stoic rise painted pictures of a woman who embodied strength and wisdom, who had survived the destruction of her traditional way of life by adapting while never losing her essential identity. "She sounds remarkable," Sarah said. "I wish I could have met her." "She would have liked you," Kai said, his arm tightening slightly around her. "She always said that the strongest people are those who survive breaking and choose to rebuild themselves into something new." "Is that what I'm doing?" Sarah asked. "Rebuilding myself? What do you think?" Sarah considered the question, thinking about the woman who had fled into the mountains seeking death and the woman who now lay in a makeshift shelter, more concerned about her partner's safety than her own survival. "The difference was remarkable. I think your grandmother was very wise," she said finally. Hours passed as they waited out the storm's fury, their conversations flowing between serious reflection and gentle teasing. In the intimate confines of their shelter, barriers that had taken weeks to build began dissolving naturally. Sarah found herself sharing memories she had never spoken aloud, while Kai revealed dreams and fears he had kept locked away during his years of solitude. When Sarah finally drifted off to sleep, it was with the profound sense that she was exactly where she belonged. Sarah woke in the makeshift shelter to find Kai already awake, his dark eyes studying her face in the dim light filtering through their blanket roof. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a profound silence that felt almost sacred after hours of nature's violence. In the quiet intimacy of their shared refuge, something fundamental had shifted between them. "Good morning," Kai said softly, his voice carrying a tenderness that made Sarah's heart flutter. "Is it still morning?" she asked, having lost all sense of time in their windowless shelter. "Does it matter?" he replied, and Sarah realized that conventional time had little meaning in this place where they existed outside normal rules and expectations. As they emerged from their cramped sanctuary, Sarah was amazed by the transformation the storm had wrought. The canyon looked like an entirely different place, scoured clean by wind and rain, with new patterns of erosion carved into the rock walls and fresh pools of water scattered across the floor. But more striking than any physical change was the emotional landscape between her and Kai. During the long hours pressed together in their shelter, barriers had dissolved without fanfare or dramatic declaration. Sarah could not pinpoint the exact moment when her last reserves of resistance had melted away, but she woke knowing with absolute certainty that she loved this man who had saved her life in more ways than one. "We'll need to rebuild," Kai said, surveying the scattered remains of their living space. But his tone suggested he was talking about more than just practical arrangements. "Yes," Sarah agreed, understanding the deeper meaning in his words. "We'll build something new, something that belongs to both of us." They spent the morning salvaging what they could from the storm's destruction and beginning the work of creating a new arrangement of their shared space. But Sarah found herself distracted by Kai's presence in ways that made simple tasks feel charged with significance. When their hands touched while moving supplies, when he smiled at something she said, when she caught him watching her with an expression of quiet wonder, each moment felt like a small revelation. It was while they were reorganizing their sleeping area that Kai produced something Sarah had never seen before, a small cradle board, intricately carved and decorated with beadwork that spoke of countless hours of loving labor. The baby carrier was sized for a newborn, its wooden frame worn smooth by handling, its leather straps soft with age. "Where did this come from?" Sarah asked, touching the beautiful object with reverent fingers. "My grandmother made it for my mother when she was expecting me," Kai said, his voice carrying both pride and sorrow. "It survived the attack because my mother had lent it to a cousin whose baby was sick. When I chose this canyon for my home, I brought it with me." Sarah studied the cradle board, seeing in its careful construction a grandmother's love for a grandchild, not yet born, a mother's hopes for the future, a family's expectation of continuity. "Why are you showing me this now?" Kai was quiet for a long moment, his hands gentle as he traced the carved patterns on the wooden frame. "Because last night, holding you while the storm raged, I found myself thinking about possibilities I had abandoned long ago, about what it might mean to create life instead of simply preserving it." Sarah's breath caught as she understood what he was telling her. "Kai, I am not asking for promises," he said quickly. "I am not demanding anything from you, but I wanted you to know that when I look at you, I see not just the woman I love, but the mother of children who might learn to read from your gentle teaching, who might grow strong in this canyon that has become our sanctuary." The image he painted, children with his dark eyes and her stubborn chin, little ones learning letters while learning to track deer, a family that bridged two worlds while belonging fully to neither, filled Sarah with a longing so intense it was almost painful. "I lost a baby," she said quietly. "The trauma from the fire, the smoke I breathed. I was 3 months along when Thomas died. I lost everything that mattered to me in one terrible day." Kai set down the cradle board and moved to her, his arms encircling her with infinite gentleness. "Then you understand how precious new life is," he said, "how worth protecting, how worth hoping for." Sarah leaned into his embrace, feeling the last of her carefully constructed walls crumble completely. "I'm scared," she admitted, "scared to want something so much that losing it would destroy me again. Fear is the price we pay for loving," Kai said, his lips brushing her temple. "But the alternative, living without love to avoid the risk of loss, is not really living at all." As Sarah looked at the cradle board that represented hope for a future she had never dared imagine, she made her choice. She chose love over fear, possibility over safety, life over the careful death of emotional isolation. The sound of horses and men shouting echoed through the canyon, just as Sarah and Kai were preparing their morning meal. But this time, the voices carried a different quality, not the rough tones of bounty hunters seeking profit, but the authoritative commands of law enforcement conducting official business. Sarah Matthews, the voice that boomed across the canyon walls, was one Sarah recognized with a mixture of love and dread. "This is Sheriff James Matthews of Colorado Territory. I know you're here, and I'm coming to bring you home." Kai's hand moved instinctively toward his knife, but Sarah caught his wrist. "That's my brother," she said, her stomach churning with conflicting emotions. "He's not like the bounty hunters. He genuinely believes he's rescuing me." Through the canyon entrance came not just her brother, but a full posse of 6 men, all wearing badges and carrying official documentation. James Matthews had always been thorough in his law enforcement work, and he had brought enough legal authority to make their presence indisputable. James himself had changed, since Sarah had last seen him 2 years ago. His brown hair showed more gray at the temples, and his face carried new lines that spoke of worry and responsibility. When his eyes found Sarah standing beside Kai, relief and fury warred across his features. "Sarah, thank God," James said, dismounting from his horse with quick, efficient movements. "When you disappeared, when the bounty hunters reported signs of struggle," his gaze shifted to Kai, taking in the Apache man's proximity to his sister, with obvious suspicion. "Step away from her. Now." "James, wait," Sarah began, but her brother was already moving toward them, with the focused intensity she remembered from their childhood, when he was determined to protect her from perceived threats. "You're under arrest for kidnapping," James announced to Kai, producing a set of iron shackles that caught the morning sunlight. "Sarah, get behind me. You're safe now." "I am safe," Sarah said, moving deliberately to stand beside Kai rather than behind her brother. "And he didn't kidnap me. He saved my life." James paused, clearly expecting his sister to cooperate with her rescue rather than resist it. "Sarah, you've been missing for over a month. People have been searching for you, fearing the worst. This man has held you captive." "This man has been my choice," Sarah interrupted, her voice carrying a strength that surprised even her. "I wasn't kidnapped, James. I ran into the mountains seeking solitude, and Kai found me when I was near death. Everything that happened afterward was my decision." The legal documents James pulled from his coat bore official seals and formal language that transformed their personal situation into a matter of territorial law. Sarah could see warrants for Kai's arrest, committal orders that would allow James to forcibly return her to Colorado for medical evaluation, and testimonies from Philadelphia residents describing her mental state before her disappearance. "These papers say you're not competent to make such decisions," James said, his voice gentling as he addressed his sister. "The trauma you suffered, the losses you endured. Everyone agrees you need proper medical care, not isolation with a savage who's taken advantage of your vulnerability." The word savage hung in the air like a slap, and Sarah felt rage building in her chest. "Kai is the most civilized man I've ever known," she said, her voice deadly quiet. "He's shown me more respect, more genuine care than anyone in so-called polite society ever did." "Stockholm Syndrome," one of the other lawmen muttered. "Captives often develop feelings for their captors. It's a known phenomenon." "Enough," Sarah said, stepping forward with authority that made the entire posse take notice. "I am 26 years old, of sound mind, and perfectly capable of making my own decisions. I choose to stay here with Kai of my own free will." James's face reflected the struggle between his love for his sister and his conviction that he was saving her from a terrible mistake. "Sarah, be reasonable. You can't live like this forever. What about your future? What about children, a proper marriage, a life in civilization? What about my happiness?" Sarah countered. "What about my right to choose what my life looks like? You're so concerned about my future that you've forgotten to ask what I want that future to contain." The standoff stretched taut between them, with Sarah's declaration of independence challenging everything James thought he knew about his duty as her brother and protector. The legal documents in his hands represented the power of law and social convention, but they could not account for the transformation Sarah had undergone in her months of supposed captivity. "You're making a mistake," James said finally, though uncertainty had crept into his voice. "Maybe," Sarah agreed. "But it's my mistake to make." The confrontation escalated when James produced a second set of documents that made Sarah's blood run cold. Among the official papers was a marriage certificate, blank except for the signatures and seal, along with formal agreements that would legitimize her union with Kai under territorial law if she chose to proceed with what James clearly considered an act of complete madness. "I brought these," James said, his voice heavy with resignation, "because our father raised me to respect your judgment, even when I disagree with it. If you truly insist on this course of action, at least do it legally. Make it official so you have the protection of law, instead of living in sin with a man who could abandon you without consequence." Sarah stared at the marriage certificate, recognizing both the love and desperation behind her brother's gesture. He was offering her a way to legitimize her choice, while still hoping the reality of legal commitment might make her reconsider what he saw as a temporary infatuation born of trauma. "James," she said softly, understanding the sacrifice he was making by bringing these documents, "you would really stand witness to a marriage you disapprove of? I would rather have a sister who makes choices I disagree with than lose you entirely to choices I never witnessed," James replied, his voice cracking slightly. "But Sarah, once this is done, once you're legally bound to this life, there's no easy path back to the world you came from." Kai had remained silent during the exchange, but now he stepped forward with the quiet dignity that Sarah had come to love. "Sheriff Matthews," he said, his accent careful but clear, "I want you to know that I love your sister more than my own life. I would never harm her or hold her against her will. That's what every man says," James replied curtly. "But love and good intentions don't put food on the table or provide security when times get hard. I have provided for Sarah every day since she arrived here," Kai said simply. "She has never gone hungry, never been cold, never been unsafe under my protection. What more security does any marriage offer?" The question hung in the air, and Sarah saw her brother struggle with its implications. His own marriage had failed within 3 years, ended by his wife's inability to tolerate the isolation and danger of frontier law enforcement. Most marriages in their social circle were arrangements of convenience as much as affection, offering women financial security in exchange for domestic service and childbearing. "Show me the ceremony you would have," James said finally, his tone suggesting he was grasping for ways to delay or complicate the process. "Prove to me this isn't just impulse born of isolation." Kai looked at Sarah, and she saw a question in his eyes. This was not how either of them had imagined making their commitment official, with her disapproving brother and his armed posse serving as reluctant witnesses. But something in the moment felt right, the need to declare their love openly, without apology or explanation to anyone who chose to judge them. "We would combine our traditions," Sarah said, finding strength in her voice as she spoke. "Apache customs that honor Kai's heritage, Christian elements that acknowledge my upbringing, and promises that belong only to us." What followed was unlike any wedding ceremony Sarah had ever witnessed. Kai spoke words in his native language that he translated as vows to protect and cherish, to share all he possessed, and to honor the spirit that had brought them together. Sarah responded with promises to stand beside him through whatever challenges they might face, to build a life that honored both their past losses and their future hopes. When they exchanged rings, Sarah's original wedding band that she removed and placed on Kai's finger, and a simple band he carved from a piece of the oak that grew near their garden, James stepped forward with obvious reluctance to sign the marriage certificate as witness. "Sarah Matthews Crowfeather," James read from the completed document, using the name Kai had chosen to represent his bond with the natural world. "I hope you know what you're doing." "I know I'm choosing love over fear," Sarah replied, studying the certificate that made their union legal in the eyes of territorial law. "I know I'm choosing a partner who sees me as I am, rather than who he wants me to become. And I know I'm choosing a life that fits my heart, rather than other people's expectations." The marriage certificate, with its official seals and formal language, represented more than legal recognition. It was proof that Sarah had claimed her right to self-determination, that she had chosen her own path despite massive pressure to conform to others' vision of her proper place in the world. As James prepared to leave with his posse, he embraced his sister with fierce protectiveness. "If you ever need anything," he said quietly, "if this life becomes more than you can bear, you always have a place with me." "I know," Sarah replied, grateful for his grudging acceptance, even as she felt certain she would never need to take refuge in her old world again. 6 months after the wedding ceremony that had shocked her brother and his posse, Sarah stood in their garden watching Kai work on their final preparations for departure. The bounty hunters had never returned after James's official visit, but the couple had decided it was time to seek an even more remote location where they could build their life without the constant possibility of unwanted visitors. As she folded their few possessions into traveling packs, Sarah's fingers found a document that had arrived the previous week, a formal letter from the Colorado Territorial Education Department, bearing official seals and signed by the superintendent himself. The correspondence had somehow found its way to their canyon through a network of contacts that still amazed her. Mrs. Crow Feather, the letter began, using her married name with bureaucratic precision, we have received reports of your exemplary work with the mixed heritage children in the mountain settlements. Your innovative teaching methods and sensitivity to cultural differences have come to our attention through testimonials from parents whose children have benefited from your instruction. Sarah had indeed begun teaching again, but in ways she never could have imagined during her years in Philadelphia's formal classroom. Word had spread through the scattered communities about the woman who combined traditional academic subjects with practical survival skills, who taught children to read using stories from multiple cultures, who understood that education meant more than memorizing facts from approved textbooks. We would like to offer you an official position as a circuit teacher for remote communities, the letter continued, with full territorial backing and a salary that reflects the challenging nature of frontier education. Your work would involve traveling between settlements that lack permanent schools, establishing temporary educational programs, and training local residents to continue instruction in your absence. The job offer represented everything Sarah had once thought impossible: official recognition of her teaching abilities after the Philadelphia fire, meaningful work that honored rather than ignored her, transformed perspective, and a career that would support rather than separate her from her life with Kai. What will you tell them? Kai asked, looking up from his own packing to study her face. I've already decided, Sarah said, folding the letter carefully. I'm going to accept. With conditions. I'll take the position only if they agree to hire you as my assistant, specializing in practical education and cultural translation. Kai's eyebrows rose in surprise. They would hire an Apache to work in territorial schools. They'll hire a man whose knowledge of wilderness survival, plant medicine, and traditional crafts could save children's lives while enriching their education, Sarah said firmly. Besides, the letter specifically mentions my total insensitivity to cultural differences. They need you, even if they don't realize it yet. The official correspondence had arrived at the perfect time, offering them a way to leave the canyon that would provide both purpose and financial independence. Sarah's informal teaching work had already proven there was demand for education that served children caught between worlds, mixed heritage students, children in isolated settlements, Native American children learning to navigate white society without losing their own cultural identity. We would travel constantly, Kai observed, but his tone suggested interest rather than objection. Never staying long enough to establish deep roots in any one place, but we would be together, Sarah replied, building something meaningful while helping children who need exactly what we have to offer. The decision to leave the canyon was bittersweet. This hidden valley had been their sanctuary, the place where they had discovered love and built their partnership. But both understood that staying would mean accepting limitations on the impact they could have in the wider world. As they prepared for their departure, Sarah found herself thinking about the children they would teach, young ones struggling to read, teenagers learning to navigate prejudice, boys and girls who needed examples of adults who had survived loss and chosen to rebuild their lives around love and purpose. Do you think we'll ever come back? Sarah asked, taking one last look around the canyon that had transformed from prison to paradise to launching point for their shared future. Perhaps, Kai said, shouldering his pack with the easy grace that never failed to make her heart flutter. But we carry the best of this place with us. The peace we found here, the love we built here, the confidence that we can create home wherever we choose to make our stand. The letter from the education department had given them more than a job offer. It had provided validation that their unconventional love story could serve a purpose larger than their individual happiness. As they walked toward the canyon entrance for the last time, Sarah felt not sadness but anticipation for the adventures that awaited two teachers ready to change the world, one child at a time. 1 year after leaving their canyon sanctuary, Sarah sat in the morning sunlight outside their temporary cabin, watching Kai teach their 6-month-old daughter to appreciate the sound of birds singing in the pine trees. In her hands, she held the tiniest pair of moccasins she had ever seen, crafted from the softest deer hide, and decorated with beadwork that told the story of a child born between worlds but beloved in both. Little Mary Ayana Crowfeather, named for the student who had given Sarah a pressed flower, and the grandmother who had taught Kai about healing, gurgled contentedly as her father pointed out different bird calls and explained their meanings in both English and Apache. At 6 months, she was already showing signs of her parents' strong will and curiosity about everything around her. "She has your stubborn chin," Kai observed, settling beside Sarah with their daughter cradled against his chest. "And your determination to explore everything she can reach," Sarah smiled, remembering how terrified she had been when she first realized she was pregnant again. The memory of her previous loss had made every day of her pregnancy feel precarious, every symptom a potential sign of disaster. But Kai's steady presence and the nomadic life that kept them moving between communities had somehow made this pregnancy feel different, less fragile, more grounded in possibility than fear. "The Henderson children are reading at a second-grade level now," Sarah reported, updating Kai on the progress of students in their current settlement. "And young Timothy asked if you would teach him to track deer next week." Their work as circuit teachers had exceeded even the Territorial Education Department's optimistic expectations. In 12 months, they had established learning programs in 8 different communities, trained 15 local residents to continue instruction after their departure, and proven that education could be both academically rigorous and culturally sensitive. More importantly, they had demonstrated that unconventional teachers could reach children that traditional methods failed to serve. Sarah's experience with loss allowed her to connect with students dealing with trauma, while Kai's knowledge of survival skills and traditional crafts provided practical education that complemented academic subjects. "Mrs. Henderson wants to know if we'll stay for the harvest festival," Kai said, stroking their daughter's dark hair with gentle fingers. "She says the whole settlement has grown fond of our little family." "And what do you think?" Sarah asked, though she could already see the answer in his expression. "I think we have found what my grandmother always said was the greatest treasure, work that serves others while honoring our own gifts," Kai replied. "But I also think our daughter will benefit from staying in one place long enough to form deeper friendships." The decision to settle permanently in the mountain community of Pine Ridge had been developing for weeks as they observed how well both they and little Mary thrived in the stable environment. The settlement was large enough to provide social connections, but small enough that everyone knew each other, progressive enough to welcome an unconventional family, but traditional enough to value education and hard work. Sarah looked at the baby moccasins in her hands, seeing in their careful construction all the love and hope that had gone into preparing for Mary's arrival. Kai had worked on them throughout her pregnancy, adding new beads and stitches as they traveled from settlement to settlement, creating something beautiful that would protect their daughter's feet as she learned to walk in the world they were building together. "James sent another letter," Sarah said, pulling the correspondence from her pocket. "He wants to visit when his duties permit. He says he has a wedding gift for us that he's been saving for the right moment." Kai raised an eyebrow. "After a year of marriage, he has finally decided to approve. I think he's decided that arguing with my happiness is a losing battle," Sarah said with a laugh. "Besides, he wants to meet his niece. Apparently the idea of being Uncle James appeals to his protective instincts." As the morning progressed, Sarah found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. From the broken woman who had sought death in the mountains, to the wife, mother, and teacher who now planned lessons while rocking her baby to sleep, the transformation seemed almost miraculous. "Do you ever miss it?" Kai asked, as if reading her thoughts. "The simplicity of our canyon life." "Sometimes," Sarah admitted, "but I've learned that growth requires leaving comfort behind. Our canyon taught us that we could survive together. This life is teaching us that we can thrive together." That evening, as she put Mary down to sleep in the cradle board that had become her favorite resting place, Sarah felt the deep contentment that comes from knowing you are exactly where you belong, doing exactly what you were meant to do, with exactly the person you were meant to love.